I've worked security for most of my life, a fair chunk of that being overnight work. Sometimes people ask me where the craziest place I've worked is, or the easiest place, or what the scariest on-the-job moment has been. Strangely enough, the answer to the second two questions is the same place. And folks are always surprised to hear it, because I honestly think the best security job I ever worked was the overnight shift at a funeral home. Some people think I'm crazy for saying that. Alone in the middle of the night with nothing but dead bodies to keep me company? But as long as you don't believe in ghosts or any of that stuff, the job is a walk in the park. Nobody in their right mind wants to break into a funeral home in the middle of the night. Not to say that they didn't have some pretty valuable stuff on site. Some of the caskets went for $8,000 to $9,000. But again, only the crackiest of the crackheads would be so without crack that they'd try to steal the fur-lined coffin, and they'd have to be built like Shaq to do it. So since I certainly didn't have to worry about anyone breaking out of the funeral home, I basically had nothing to do. I guess the funeral home just chalked me up as an expense, something to reassure the relatives of the deceased that they were being properly watched over or whatever. But I'm serious. Aside from the odd walk around, all I did was watch TV and lift weights. But ironically enough, it was at this cushy security job that I had the creepiest encounter of my entire life. I was about 6 months into the job, and aside from the whole overnight thing, I was loving every second of it. I started learning Spanish to try and impress this Dominican chick that I was vibing with. So I spent most of the first night walking around with my headphones on, repeating Spanish phrases to absolutely no one. At one point, I'm sitting in the manager's office, which is where their bank of security monitors was, and I casually look over to check if they're all clear. Now keep in mind that all of the times that I've looked at those monitors over the past 6 months, the most I've seen was like a fox. The rest of the time, they've been totally clear of any activity, either animal or human. Only this night, as I'm trying to understand the Spanish verb to be, I see someone standing perfectly still in the parking lot of the funeral home. The sight instantly gets this "what?" reaction out of me. Not because I was seeing someone for the first time, but because they were just standing there perfectly still, staring at the building. It was so still for so long that if it wasn't for the clock numbers ticking away in the corner of the screen, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the picture had frozen. But then he moved, just shifted a little, and I realized he was really just standing there like a statue, eyes glued to the funeral home. It was real cold out that night, so I put my jacket, hat, and gloves on in preparation for going outside to warn the person off. Then just before I walked out of the office, I checked the screen again. Nothing. There was no longer anyone standing there. Best case scenario, there was just some drunk that moved on. Worst case scenario, it called for a sweep of the entire exterior. I walked out into the parking lot but didn't see anyone. But just because I didn't see him didn't mean he wasn't there. So I commenced checking around the building to make sure Statue Man wasn't fixing to start trouble. I'm shining my flashlight, seeing nothing. Then when I check around back to where the fire door was, I hear some scampering sound followed by quick footsteps. This SOB must have seen my flashlight beam before I turned the corner and just up and ran off before I could get to him. Because when I turned the corner, all I saw was some hooded figure beating feet about 50 yards away from me. Remember what I said about the crackiest of the crackheads needing crack so bad that they rob a funeral home? Well, that's what I figured it was, and since I don't mess with no crackheads, I just went right back inside, made sure the rear door was secure, and called the cops to file a report. I didn't need a unit sent over or anything. I just wanted them to have something on file for next time I called because I had this bad feeling that I'd be calling them back about this guy very soon. And I was right. The second time I caught the guy sneaking around, he was much more ballsy about it. I stopped listening to my Spanish lessons at work, and for good reason, because the next time the guy visited, I heard him before I saw him. He tried to open up the front doors, bold as brass. The first time, I heard the faint sound of them refusing to open as the manager's office was almost straight across from the entrance. The second time, at which point I knew something was wrong, was when the guy violently tried to rip the doors open or something, because I heard this almighty crash before I ran to see what was going on. Now the funeral home had 2 sets of framed glass double doors, meaning you could look right through each way. I didn't see the guy's face very well, but he sure saw mine. And just like the first time I caught him, he just ran off into the night. The same thing kept happening for weeks on end. At first, once a week, then sometimes twice a week. Then by the end of it all, I was having to chase this guy off 3 times a week. Sometimes I called the cops every single time, giving the best description I could, but they never got back to me saying that they picked anyone up or noticed anything during their patrols. I'm not sure what they were looking for or if the guy kept off the roads to stay low-key, but it is what it is, I guess. I was there just to do my job and protect the dead people. It didn't scare me or anything. It was just incredibly annoying, to be honest. I had this incredibly cushy job, and this creepy guy kept showing up and forcing me to actually do my job. I know, he hardly seems like a monster, but just wait, I haven't even gotten to the creepy part yet, which happened way at the end of the whole Midnight Visitor saga. So the last time the guy showed up, I expected it to go down just like all the other times. I saw him on the camera, standing totally still in the parking lot, just like the first time I'd spotted him. He did that a lot, by the way, especially when he finally figured out that he just couldn't break in. But every time I walked out to shoo him off, he'd always run away before I could say a word to him. Only this time, the final time, as I walk out of the office and he spots me through the glass doors, he doesn't run, he doesn't move, he just stares me down as I walk out into the dark parking lot. Don't get me wrong, the sudden change of tactics definitely made me a little nervous, and I started to worry if he had some kind of weapon on him. But just the chance of being able to ask the guy why, after weeks and weeks of crazy curiosity, I just couldn't find it in myself to pass that up. I didn't walk up to him or anything. I just stepped out of the double doors and into the dark parking lot, watching as he stared back at me from under his hood. That's when I first realized how young the guy actually was. I mean, he looked like a kid, but just from the size of him and the patchy facial hair, you could tell that he was late teens or maybe early 20s. He also wasn't mad-dogging me like I thought he would be either. He looked kind of sad and tired as I stared back at him. A few seconds or so passed before I finally asked him why he kept showing up there in the middle of the night. He didn't say anything in reply, but, and I know this sounds a little out there, it was like he was trying to talk, but he just couldn't. I figured that he might be a little slow or something. He definitely didn't look like a crackhead, so when it turned to look like I was going to be the one doing all the talking, I just rolled out the rest of my piece. I told him that he needed to stay away from the funeral home, that I was running out of patience with him, and if he showed up again, I was going to catch him and beat him down. I wasn't too aggressive about it. It came out more like a friendly warning, but still the guy didn't say anything, and he just looked back at me, still seeming all sad. I figured that I'd try just once more to talk to him, and if he didn't want to talk back, I'd just go inside and call the cops like usual. I honestly didn't bet on him piping up that time either, so I asked the most fundamental question in my mind. Why? Why keep showing up week after week, trying to get into a funeral home at night? But again, nothing, at least until I turned to walk back into the building, because that's when the guy finally found the words to tell me what he wanted, and I'll be cold in my grave before I forget what he said. About 15 years ago, I was living in the high desert of Los Angeles County, attending college full-time and working 2 jobs. One of those jobs was as a night security guard at a church campus that also had a private school on the property. The campus was pretty big, with several buildings, playgrounds, and parking lots. It had 2 main entrances, one on the west side and another on the north side. My job was to patrol the area, making sure everything was safe and secure during the night. At night, we would close the gate on the north side and station a guard in a car nearby to prevent break-ins and guide any traffic to the main entrance. The north side of the property had a few old trailer buildings that the church had bought secondhand and converted into classrooms. These trailers were a bit run down and often needed repairs, and one of them, in particular, was always causing issues, whether it was strange noises, faulty lights, or doors that wouldn't stay locked. So this building became the main source of problems during my night shifts. Whenever I was stationed at the back entrance, I would get a strong feeling that someone was watching me. It was so intense that my hair would stand on end, I'd get goosebumps, and I'd feel really paranoid. It was clear I was being watched, and it didn't feel like I was welcome there. I wasn't the only one who felt this way. Most of the crew experienced it too. So eventually we decided to investigate it more seriously. Whenever there was a new guy, we would assign him to the back entrance on his first night without telling him anything. And after a few hours, we'd drive by to see how he was doing. And he'd usually look nervous, or he would have moved the car so it wasn't facing the building. Now, part of our job was to make sure all the doors of the buildings were locked, and if they weren't, we had to go inside to ensure no one was staying there. But this particular building was always strange, like lights would turn on or flicker in the middle of the night, and inside, chairs and desks would be slightly moved around, like desks would be crooked or chairs pulled out. Then one night when I was back there, I locked the building, but when I checked it later, the door was unlocked. Now I had to go inside and see what was going on. The place felt creepy, especially at night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By now I was really scared, and I could tell whatever was in there was angry. I called in another guard and we entered the building together, checking every corner and closet but didn't find anything out of place. As we were heading back to the front door, we suddenly heard a loud, noticeable creak from the floor, like someone had just taken a step. We froze, looking around, but saw nothing. The sound felt unsettling, especially after everything else that had happened. Then we heard a sound that was like blowing air, or wind moving quickly above the ceiling tiles from that classroom towards us. When it reached right above us, it suddenly stopped and went completely silent. It wasn't the AC system because the ducts weren't in that part of the ceiling, and the system was turned off. We ran out of there as fast as we could. I'm not saying it was a ghost or a spirit, but something was definitely in that building, and it felt really creepy.